Ambassador Al stood at the edge of the crowd, their four eyes blinking in confusion. The noise was overwhelming. Drums pounded. Horns blared. People danced in the streets of New Orleans, spinning and laughing as a wooden box was carried on the shoulders of 6 humans. The box contained a dead body. Al checked their translator 3 times. There was no mistake. This was a funeral. These humans were mourning the loss of someone they loved. But they were dancing. They were smiling. Some were crying, yes, but those same tears mixed with laughter as an old woman told a story about the deceased man's terrible cooking. "He once burned water," the woman said, wiping her eyes. "I swear on my mother's grave he burned water, set off every smoke alarm in the building trying to boil eggs." The crowd erupted in laughter. Al's skin shifted to a pale blue, the color of deep confusion. For 200 cycles, Al had served the collective as a cultural observer. They had witnessed the mating rituals of the war dances of the silent prayers of the. But nothing in all of Al's training had prepared them for this. On Prime, death was handled very differently. When a died, those who loved them entered the silence. For 30 days, the mourners stayed alone in dark chambers. They spoke to no one. They ate little. They destroyed every object that reminded them of the dead, every gift given, every image captured, every piece of clothing worn together. By the end of the silence, it was as if the dead person had never existed at all. This was mercy, the elders taught. This was kindness. To remember was to suffer. To forget was to heal. But these humans refused to forget. They celebrated instead. That night, Al sent an urgent transmission to the High Archivist on Prime. "I believe I have made an error," Al wrote. "The humans appear to be celebrating rather than mourning. Please advise if I should seek out proper death rituals elsewhere." The response came quickly. "Your data is contaminated. Find proper mourning rituals and document them correctly." So Al searched. They traveled to Ireland where they witnessed a wake. Humans gathered around an open casket, drinking something called whiskey and telling stories about the dead man. The stories grew more outrageous as the night went on. People laughed until they cried. They sang songs. They argued about who would keep the man's fishing rod, and the argument somehow turned into more laughter. "He would have loved this," someone said. "He would have been right here telling the worst jokes." Al documented everything. They traveled to Mexico during something called Lowe's. Families gathered in graveyards, but not to weep. They brought food. They brought music. They decorated the graves with bright orange flowers and photographs of the dead. Children ran between the headstones, laughing. An old woman sat beside a grave, eating her husband's favorite meal and talking to the stone as if he could hear her. "I made your enchiladas, she said. Extra spicy, just how you liked them. The doctor said they were bad for your heart, but I never listened to that fool, and neither did you." In Japan, Al observed a memorial where paper lanterns were released into the night sky. Each lantern carried a message for someone who had died. The humans watched the lights float upward, their faces peaceful. "Where do the messages go?" Al asked a young woman. She smiled. "To them, to wherever they are now." "You believe they still exist?" "I believe love does not end with death," she said simply. Al's reports grew longer and more detailed. They documented funeral feasts and memorial tattoos, tribute concerts and scholarship funds established in the names of the dead. They recorded humans wearing the jewelry of their lost mothers, displaying photographs of their dead fathers, naming their children after grandparents they would never meet. The humans did not erase their dead. They carried them forward. Then the message arrived from Prime. Al read it 3 times, their skin shifting through confusion, disbelief, and finally, a deep, terrible gray. Al was dead. Al's clutch sibling, hatched from the same brood, raised in the same dwelling, closer than any other being in the universe. Al had been killed in an accident at the transit hub. The body had already been processed. The silence had already begun for the family. Al was ordered to return immediately. 30 days of darkness awaited, 30 days of isolation. And then, according to tradition, every trace of Al would be destroyed, every image, every gift, every memory made physical. Al packed their belongings slowly. On the desk sat a small stone Al had given them before the journey to Earth. It was an ugly thing, rough and brown, but Al had found it in the caves where they played as children. "So you will not forget home," Al had said. According to the silence, this stone would need to be destroyed. It was a reminder. It was a tie to one who no longer existed. It was suffering made solid. Al held the stone and thought of New Orleans. They thought of the widow laughing about burned water. They thought of lanterns rising into the sky. For the first time in their life, Al hesitated to obey. The darkness was absolute. Al sat alone in the mourning chamber exactly as tradition demanded. No light, no sound, no company. The walls were thick enough to block all sensation from the outside world. This was the silence, this was mercy. On the first day, Al tried to follow the old ways. They sat with their eyes closed and attempted to empty their mind. The elders taught that grief was poison. The silence allowed the poison to drain away. By speaking no words, by seeing no reminders, by destroying all connections to the dead, a could heal completely. But Al could not empty their mind. Every time they tried, they saw Al's face. They remembered the sound of their siblings' laugh, the way Al always tilted their head when confused, the small stone that now sat hidden in Al's travel bag instead of being destroyed. Keeping the stone was forbidden. Al knew this, but they could not let it go. By the 5th day, the isolation had become unbearable. In New Orleans, Al had watched a widow surrounded by friends. In Mexico, they had seen a grandmother sharing stories with her. Here in the darkness, Al was completely alone. No one to share the weight of loss. No one to speak Al's name. Speaking the name was also forbidden. To speak it was to summon the dead back, to chain them to this world, to prevent their spirit from finding peace. So the elders taught. On the 12th day, Al broke. "Al," they said aloud. The word echoed in the empty chamber. Al's voice cracked on the syllables. "Your name was Al. You were my sibling. You gave me a stone before I left for Earth, and you told me not to forget home." Once they started, they could not stop. The words poured out like water through a broken dam. Al spoke of childhood games and adult arguments. They described Al's kindness and stubbornness. They confessed secrets they had never shared with anyone. They laughed remembering Al's terrible sense of direction. They cried when they recalled that they would never hear their sibling's voice again. They spoke for hours, days. They spoke until their voice gave out, and then they rested and spoke again. When the silence ended and the chamber doors opened, Al walked out to face judgment. Word had spread. Someone had heard them speaking through the walls. The violation was too great to ignore. Al was brought before the Cultural Tribunal, the highest court of the collective. High Archivist led the council. "You broke the silence," said. Their voice was cold. "You spoke the name of the dead. You have committed one of our oldest crimes." Al stood before them, exhausted but no longer afraid. Something had changed during those days in the dark. "I did," they said, "and I am here to explain why. There is no explanation that justifies. I studied humans." Al's voice cut through the chamber. "I was sent to document their death rituals. I expected to find primitives weeping and wailing without control. Instead, I found something we have lost." The tribunal members shifted uncomfortably. Al continued. "Humans keep photographs of their dead on their walls. They display them proudly. They point to them and tell their children, 'This was your grandmother. She loved to garden. She made the best bread in the province.' The children grow up knowing people they never met, loving them through stories." "This is precisely the suffering we prevent," interrupted. "Memory is a chain." "Or perhaps memory is a bridge," Al said. "Humans name their children after the dead. They establish scholarships in their names. They plant trees. They build monuments. They refuse to let their loved ones disappear. And you know what I observed? The humans who remember are not trapped in grief. They carry their dead forward with joy. Silence filled the tribunal chamber. They believe, Al continued, that speaking someone's name keeps them alive, not in body but in spirit, in memory, in the impact they leave behind. We believe that erasing the dead protects us from pain, but I sat alone in that dark chamber and I felt Al slipping away, not dying again but disappearing, becoming nothing, and that was worse than any grief. His face remained hard. Our traditions exist for good reason. The silence was developed by our ancestors after the Great Mourning, when entire communities were paralyzed by loss. We cannot return to that chaos. I am not asking us to abandon all tradition, Al said. I am asking us to consider whether the silence truly heals, or whether it simply forces us to suffer alone. The tribunal members began to murmur among themselves. Then, from the back of the chamber, an old voice spoke. The ambassador is not the first to break the silence. Al turned. Al, their parent, stood in the entrance. Ancient and respected, Al had served on councils for nearly 400 cycles. The entire chamber fell silent. I have kept a token from every family member I have lost, Al said, walking slowly forward. For 200 cycles I have hidden small pieces of those I loved, a thread from a robe, a piece of writing, a stone. They looked at Al. I gave you that stone originally. It belonged to my parent who gave it to me before their death. The tribunal members stared. This was confession of repeated, lifelong crime from one of the most respected elders of the collective. I am not alone, Al continued. They looked around the chamber. How many here have kept something? How many have whispered a name in the dark when no one could hear? The silence stretched. Then slowly hands began to rise, first one, then three, then a dozen. Elder after elder, council member after council member confessing to the same forbidden act. The silence, it seemed, had never been as absolute as the collective believed. His face twisted with conflict. This is unprecedented. Our entire mourning structure is built on principles that, apparently, many of us do not follow. Perhaps, Al said gently, that tells us something important about those principles. The tribunal did not punish Al that day. Instead, they did something that had not happened in centuries. They formed a council to study whether mourning practices should evolve, and they asked Al to lead it. 6 months passed. The council met weekly, debating traditions that had stood for thousands of cycles. Not everyone agreed that change was needed. Some elders insisted that the silence was sacred and should not be altered. Others worried that opening the door to memory would unleash grief that their society could not handle. Al listened to all of them. They had learned patience from watching humans mourn. Grief moved at its own pace. Change would move slowly too. But slowly, opinions shifted. More came forward with their own hidden memories, their secret tokens, their whispered names. A young parent spoke of wanting their children to know about a grandparent who had died before their birth. An elder confessed that they had spent centuries wondering what their first love would have thought of their life choices. A group of siblings revealed that they met secretly each year on the anniversary of their parents' death, simply to speak together about the one they had lost. The collective had been breaking its own rules for generations. The question now was whether to acknowledge this truth openly. The council developed new rituals slowly and carefully. They did not abolish the silence entirely. Many still needed time alone with their grief, and the tradition offered structure during the worst days. But they added something new. After the silence ended, there would now be an option. Those who wished could participate in what the council called the remembrance. The first public remembrance took place on a cool evening under the pale light of Prime's 3 moons. Al had not known what to expect. Perhaps a small gathering of the most progressive families. Perhaps polite acknowledgement of the new option and little actual participation. Instead, thousands came. They gathered in the great plaza at the center of the capital city. Some had lost loved ones recently. Others had lost them cycles ago, even centuries ago, and had carried the weight of forbidden memories ever since. They came alone and in families. They came nervous and uncertain, but they came. Al stood before them, still amazed that this was happening at all. For as long as any of us can remember, Al began, we have been taught that forgetting is kindness, that erasing the dead protects us from pain, that the silence is mercy. They paused. But many of us have discovered that silence can also be lonely, that erasing can feel like losing someone twice, that what we truly need is not to forget but to remember together. A hush fell over the crowd. Tonight we try something new. Tonight we speak the names of those we have lost. We share stories. We remember, not to chain ourselves to the past, but to carry the past forward with us into the future. Al lifted a small, rough stone. This belonged to my sibling, Al. I kept it against tradition because I could not bear to let them disappear. Tonight I share them with you. And then Al did something that would have been unthinkable a year ago. They told stories. They described Al's terrible sense of direction, how they once got lost walking to their own dwelling. They spoke of Al's kindness to strangers, their stubbornness in arguments, their loyalty to friends. They laughed. They cried. And when they finished, the plaza was silent for a long moment. Then Al stepped forward. The ancient elder spoke of their own parent, gone for 2 centuries, whose stone now sat on Al's desk. Others followed. One by one approached and shared their memories. Some spoke quietly. Some wept. Some laughed. Some simply sat in silence, listening to others speak, finding comfort in community where they had once found only isolation. Not everyone spoke. That was allowed too. The council had created a term for those who wished to be present without sharing. They called it the warm silence. It was quiet but not alone. Hours passed. The moons crossed the sky, and still the remembrance continued. Near the end of the night, Al noticed a small child tugging at their grandmother's robe. The grandmother had just finished speaking about a lost son. The child's face was bright with curiosity. "What was he like?" the child asked. "Tell me more about him." The grandmother hesitated. Old habits were strong. For all of her life, she had been taught not to speak of the dead, not to burden children with knowledge of those they would never meet. But the child looked up at her with such eager eyes, so hungry to know about family that existed before their birth. "He loved to cook," the grandmother said finally. Her voice was soft at first, uncertain. "He was not very good at it. He burned things constantly, but he never stopped trying. He said food was love made visible, and he wanted everyone to feel loved." The child smiled. "I want to cook too." "Then perhaps he lives on in you," the grandmother said. And she smiled too, tears on her face but peace in her eyes. Al watched this small exchange and felt something shift inside them. This was what humans had understood all along. Death was not an ending. It was a transformation. The dead did not disappear when they were remembered. They became part of something larger. They lived on in stories and traditions, in the people who carried their memory forward. In the weeks that followed, the remembrance spread across Prime. Other cities held their own gatherings. Families created their own small rituals. Some planted gardens in memory of the lost. Others created art. Some simply began displaying images of the dead in their dwellings, visible for the first time in generations. Not everyone embraced the change. Some elders insisted that the old ways were better. Some communities continued to practice strict silence. The council did not force anyone to change. They simply offered an alternative. Choice, they found, was its own form of healing. One evening, Al sat in their dwelling, composing a new entry for the Galactic Anthropological Archive. The project that had brought them to Earth was finally complete. But the conclusion was nothing like what Al had expected when they first arrived. "Human mourning rituals," Al wrote, "appear chaotic to outside observers. They laugh at funerals. They celebrate death anniversaries. They speak constantly of those they have lost, keeping the dead alive through story and memory. Initial observations suggested this was primitive behavior, a failure to properly process grief. Extended study reveals a different truth. Humans understand something that the collective had forgotten. Grief is not a poison to be drained. It is a thread connecting the living to the dead. It is painful, yes, but it is also precious. It is the proof that love does not end with death. The tradition of silence was developed to protect the living from pain, but in protecting us, it also isolated us. It forced us to suffer alone. It erased the very people we loved most, turning them into forbidden memories. Humans taught us that there is another way. They taught us that joy and grief can exist together. They taught us that speaking someone's name keeps them alive in the hearts of those who remember. Al paused, considering how to end the entry. Then they added one final note. The language now contains a new word coined by the Mourning Council 6 months ago. The word is. It has no direct translation into any other known language, but the closest approximation would be the joy of remembering. It describes the feeling of speaking about someone you have lost and finding not just sadness but warmth, connection, love that continues beyond death. This word did not exist before humans arrived. Now it is spoken across our world. Al saved the entry and turned away from the console. On the shelf beside their desk sat a collection of objects, a small, rough stone from the caves of their childhood, a holographic image of Al, displayed openly for anyone to see, and beside it, images of friends made on Earth, the Irish family who had invited them to a wake, the Mexican grandmother who had shared enchiladas at her husband's grave, the Japanese woman who had explained about lanterns and love. Al spoke their sibling's name aloud, as they did every evening now. Al. The word hung in the air, no longer forbidden, no longer a crime, simply a name, a memory, a bridge connecting today to yesterday, the living to the dead, grief to joy. For the first time since their sibling's death, Al smiled. The humans had been right all along. Love did not end with death. It simply changed form, and those who were remembered never truly disappeared. They lived on, in stories and stones, and the hearts of those who refused to forget.